Well, a very warm welcome to another vlog. In this week's video, I'd like to share with you how I took this image. It's an image taken here in my garden using the Nikon Z8 with a 400 2.8 lens, utilizing the Nikon pre-release capture functionality. Today's video will build on a video I published about this time last year on the Nikon pre-release capture function, a more technical video. But I'd like to share how I took that image and also some insights or tips, if you will, on what I have learned since. At the start of January, and it's the 1st of February today, I spent a number of days here in the garden exploring and experimenting with the Nikon pre-release capture function, with backgrounds and with positioning feeders. So the video is going to be structured in a number of tips. And the first tip is about the background, the selection of the background, the distance we need to be from the background, the distance the bird feeder needs to be from the background, the height and other aesthetic considerations with regards to positioning the feeder. Now, when I set the hide up on the patio here, it was with some planning and good consideration. Because last year I had used the back of the garden and some darker backgrounds. But this year, after growing some wildflowers during the summer, those wildflowers, I've left them. And they formed a beautiful, soft, brittle background. And I was hoping that I could capture that as a background with the birds flying in front of them. So before I walk through the background, the feeder, the height of the feeder, the distance of the feeder from the background, and then the distance of our camera, the focal length, from the area we want to photograph. Let's do something very essential, which is feed the birds. Mary Poppins, tuppence a bag. If you remember that wonderful film, well, bird food now is a lot more than tuppence a bag. But it's a pleasure feeding these beautiful creatures in winter. Now, if we observe closely the different parts of our gardens, we'll find there are areas that just provide beautiful backgrounds. And that might not be obvious when we look upon those areas with our eyes, because everything looks a bit scraggly and unkempt, really, in wintertime. But I put the 400mm lens at 2.8, sitting about 5 or 6 yards back from this area. And at 2.8, it looked stunning. As you can see now, it really does look like a mess. These are wildflower seeds that I planted, filled with butterflies and various insects in the summer of last year. but I haven't cut them down. And you'll see the beautiful shapes here, particularly this shape. And as this little project progressed, my eye honed in to different areas. For instance, this tick stalk here, I avoided because it was just too dominant in the frame. So I had slowly positioned the feeder here so that when the birds fly on and off, they're about 3 or 4 inches in front of these little heads here. And see as this stalk curved down here, and this little stalk, just this chap here, I better not break it off, because this stalk is the star of the images that I've taken. It's one of the main features. And it's only when we sit down and observe a scene that looks promising closely that we might find even more minute details that we can build a photograph around. And that's what I've done here. Now I've used an old frame of a hammock. It looks a bit odd sitting in the garden here, but it serves a purpose because it provides the perfect height and a hook there for the bird feeder. And I've raised that hammock up. I've just put a plant pot and an old tile underneath it to give it enough lift so that when the bird lands, and birds tend to land on the bottom of the feeder more than the top of the feeder, but when it flies from the feeder, it's directly in front of these little seed heads and that beautiful curve. And the image that I showed at the start of the video of the long-tailed tit and the coal tit, this is central to the image. What we don't have today that really made the image and makes all our images is glorious light. Because today the background is quite dull, but even that can make a beautiful image at the right aperture. So the feeder is positioned at a very intentful height. It's also positioned about 2 to 3 inches in front of the stalk, 4 inches maybe. Now I had the feeder previously within the actual area of the stalks, but I found, and I put an image up there, that either some of the stalks would run across the bird or else there was just too much structure in the image. So therefore I really wanted to use the stalks here of the wildflowers as a backdrop, an out of focus backdrop. But I wanted some detail in there. I wanted the little seed heads here to be clear, even though diffused, but to be clearly seen in the frame. So the second tip is centered around being comfortable as a photographer and allowing us to spend a long time at a project like this. Now, even though we're shooting in the garden, I would highly recommend that you purchase a small hide. And most hides are very reasonably priced. I have this hide many years and have many enjoyable hours photographing in it, from woodlands to wetlands. Using it in the garden, it means we're committing to spending time photographing the birds. And a project such as this, even though it's within our garden, it requires time, planning and careful consideration, as you'll see throughout this video. Now, if you're going to invest in a hide, I'd highly recommend you also invest in a very comfortable fabric seat, such as this one. And this is from the same makers of the hide, Tragapan. And it really is a beautiful, comfortable seat that you could spend many, many hours in. It's got lovely pockets in here for whatever you may need while seated in the hide. It's also at the perfect height for the camera space in the hide also. So tomorrow morning I'm going to get up, I'm going to put the chair in now, set up the tripod, and I'll come back, and what I'd like to do is explain the background, as we saw earlier, those beautiful faded beige wildflower stems, and how I go about creating a composition. So now that I'm inside the hide, I'm nice and comfortable. I'm snug. I brought the hat in, but it's on the ground at the moment. I have the camera on the tripod, and I've ensured that it's positioned at the right height, and that's the height I expect the bird to be flying from the feeder, or from a twig to the feeder. Now, over the course of a few days, I remember setting up the feeder with the background and then coming back out of the hide, micro adjustment, back into the hide. It wasn't quite right. So the process is iterative of moving the feeder, even moving the actual hide to ensure that we're framing our picture so that the background is as we want it when the bird flies into it. And I have set up a scene and then set up another scene that could be only half a foot away and made micro adjustment after micro adjustment. And I think that's really important because eventually we'll get, I'm just using the light from the back of the camera to light my face here, but it's really important just to put the time in and to try to perfect your background or get a background that really pleases you. So that's the first tip with regards to working the scene. Another important consideration is that that background changes. The perception, the look and feel of the background, it changes dependent on the direction of light, depending on whether we have morning light, late afternoon light, or on a day like today, it's overcast. Now, another consideration is there are periods in the day that tend to be busier for birds. And I find around an hour and a half after sunrise, sunrise tends to be quite quiet. They take a while to wake up and come in. And similarly, at sunset, it tends to be quiet, but an hour and a half before sunset, that's when the activity is going. So the next tip is species observation. I found myself observing individual birds and species. For example, grey tits will only spend a second or two on the feeder. Cold tits a little longer, and blue tits can persist and stay on the feeder for some time. So if you're half pressing the pre-release capture button, remember that you could be half pressing it for quite a long time. And also remember that on Nikons and the Nikon Z8, after 90 seconds of half pressing, it resets. So if you fully press the shutter after 90 seconds, it's not going to take pre-captured images. Goldfinches, they're a little bit of a nuisance. Beautiful birds. But if you don't want to take photographs of goldfinches, you want to focus on the titmice, goldfinches will stay on your peanut feeder all day. They'll just sit there and then they'll fight with other birds to keep them off the feeder. What I find best is I set up a Niger seed feeder close by, and that keeps the goldfinches away from the peanut feeder if I want to focus on other species. Now, long-tailed tits, they present a different challenge altogether because they arrive infrequently. They tend to come in the morning time, around an hour after sunrise here, and then they'll visit again an hour and a half before sunset and around about sunset, just before they go to bed. But they come in large numbers. So if we have a wide area autofocus and the camera can only focus on one bird at a time, and if you have 5 or 6 long-tailed tits on the feeder, it's going to latch on to one bird, and it's unlikely that that bird is the one that's going to fly. And when you try to get your bird in flight image, you'll find most of them are out of focus. The best solution I've found for this is just take lots of images. I have a FM button set up for 3D so that it locks onto one bird after a while, but I just don't think that's a feasible solution given the level of activity. And finally, on species observation, if the greater spotted woodpecker comes in, everything just clears off, and the woodpecker will hog the feeder and can stay for quite some time. I haven't got a decent shot of a woodpecker. I'll put a photograph up there of an attempt. What I found is they fly to the back of the feeder rather than to the right or left, which prevents a good image of them. And another very important consideration is giving the birds enough space within the frame. So for a great spotted woodpecker, I will need to get further from the feeder to give more space that the bird can fly into, and we can capture the whole bird as it flies off. So camera settings, let's talk about camera settings. And I would have covered most of these points. There's some new ones in the video last year, and I'll link to that just up to the right here. So number one, I find a 0.5 second, half a second buffer time is plenty. Use wide area autofocus, so cover the full frame of the camera or as much as possible, and then position the feeder on the very right or left hand side, and you're hoping that the autofocus is going to latch onto the eye as the bird flies from the feeder. Shutter speed, a really important one, and we need to consider shutter speed in respect of ISO. At the moment, I'm at 10,000 ISO. It's just an overcast day. But I really have found that 2,500 of a second is enough. It's just enough to capture sharp images of these birds. The other thing that 2,500 of a second gives you is blurred wings. So you can get a mix of a sharp eye, sharp head, and that beautiful blurred wings. And they're the types of images I prefer. I have gone up to 4,200 of a second, just to be sure. But I find that capturing the bird's razor sharp wings, head, etc., it feels a little bit static. Yeah, I prefer a little bit of movement in the wings. So my final tip in today's video is about pre-release capture. The technology is so amazing for wildlife photography. It's set up, it's just made for photographing birds in flight in your garden, because we've controlled so many variables and we're photographing events that occurred in the past. So try not to treat it as something I'll have to try sometime. Try not to treat it as a gimmick. Build a project around it, because the results I've got here in the garden are just wondrous to me. And I'm delighted with the images that I'm picking up here. To try to replicate those images in the wilderness would be very, very difficult indeed. And these are wild birds that just happen to come into our garden in winter. Now, in my last video, you might recall I talked a little bit about the time that we can apportion to photography. And it's no different. The advantage of working in the garden is that we can mix a little bit of gardening and a little bit of bird photography. Now, there's one tip that I left out, which is that the Nikon Z8, it reduces the quality of the JPEG, and pre-release capture is only available in JPEG. But as you change the frames per second, 30 frames per second gives us the highest quality JPEG. But if we switch down to 60 frames per second, it crops into DX mode, and 120 frames per second, we get a much poorer quality JPEG. I haven't actually measured that up in the office, but I may well do that. But just to be conscious of that limitation when we're shooting, because that challenge that we face as wildlife photographers every single time we go out, the balance between ISO, shutter speed and available light, it's a real consideration when we come to shooting and using pre-release capture on our cameras. So I'm going to finish the vlog there. I'm going to leave you with a number of the images and maybe some video that I've captured here using the wildflowers as a backdrop over the course of 4 or 5 days at the start of January. So I very much hope you've enjoyed the video. are on pre-release capture and that you find the information useful. And I really hope if you get a chance to use pre-release capture on the Nikon system or on any camera model, because it's across all the camera models now. So until next time, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see where the road takes us down. So here is the set of raw images that preceded the image I took of the long-tailed tit backing off from the cold tit. We can see the cold tit starts off on the feeder with the autofocus on the cold tit. But as the cold tit flies, the long-tailed tit accidentally flies into the plane of focus. And with a little bit of luck, I managed to capture that image of the two birds in focus, face to face.